actually here just as a front, I'll be honest. The actual work has been done by other people. We have a team beginning with Sunil, and you saw a whole bunch of people come on the stage. Tarini, there's Nayanika, there was Arjun, there is Shailin, and have I missed somebody? Maybe I have. Along with that, actually, what we did is that we had done an offsite where a whole lot of us went there along with a large team from ASCI. So what you see is really the culmination of a lot of work from a lot of people. I merely happen to be in front of you presenting the outcome in a sense. I urge you to look at the report because that will have details that I will not be sharing with you. And I think you will find it genuinely very interesting. I think it is the lot of every generation to be baffled by the next. I think that is one of the, it's the way of life. It's a time honored tradition for new generations to confound the earlier one, and for the earlier generation to always wonder and worry about how is this generation going to cope. So to that extent, there is nothing new. But with time, I think the speed of bewilderment has increased. I think, and certainly we got a sense of that when we heard Miraya speaking about things that some of us have no idea about, and speak so eloquently and with such great sense of authority and confidence. But I do think that there is something fundamentally different about Gen Alpha, and through years and years of kind of studying different cohorts, different generations, one has always seen differences. But I think the kind of difference that we see today when we look at this generation is something that goes beyond that, and I think it's important for us to acknowledge and take note of it. Let's look at just some of the things that we hear around us. If some of us are parents, a lot of us otherwise would not have heard of these things. Suddenly, there is this allusion to something called 6-7. There are a bunch of kids who just go 6-7-6, and suddenly in a classroom, you will find everyone erupting saying 6-7-6-7. And it is confounding as to what does that mean. It has no, and there are origin stories, all of them, none of them actually make sense. It's a meaningless phrase that has triggered a global children's frenzy. There we have the audience speak. So I suspect a lot of booing is going to take place during my presentation. And it doesn't help to have a 63-year-old person come and talk to you about 6-7 and Gen Alpha. In fact, my daughter's also a millennial, so I'm like really far removed from Gen Alpha. But yeah, so I apologize in advance, Miraya and Madhav. Yeah. So it is something that is intensely meaningful to the cohort and intensely meaningless to people who cannot comprehend what it's all about. Brain rot, of course, we hear about brain rot videos. We talk about floating heads in toilets and some such seemingly absurd and nonsensical imagery operating as an insider code for a generation. And there is an entire body of work that we'll see, which corresponds to brain rot. Ganji Chudail, for instance, is this meme that is doing. These are all things that young people like you have told us are happening, and I'm just playing it back. So it's an amazing, it's a frightening cartoon which has become an endearing cultural icon. You see brands have associated with. There's a very famous collaboration with Nykaa, for instance, which uses Ganji Chudail in a very interesting way. It's a subversion of adult coded horror. It's stripped of backstory and serves more as an aesthetic layer, and that's a kind of a theme that we will come back to. Lot of popularity of anime, and we find it's if you think about anime and if you look at its representation, it's a very strong visual world that anime creates. And if you look at the visual coding of anime, it is emotionally, it is hyper emotional kind of a renditions. And the stories are based on themes that are quite adult, quite dark, but they are brought to you in a way that are accessible for this generation. Young protagonists are psychologically complex people that carry feelings with intensity and nuance. These are little bodies that carry a lot of feeling. And I think that you see that it's compressed feeling, coded symbolic feeling that you see in the manner in which anime gets represented. Trends that feel new, that they feel bizarre to an older generation, they feel hard to fathom, especially when you think of them as children. Our imagination of children, if it is in a generation like mine, is always a sense of a parental kind of needing parents to step in, to interpret the world, to explain the world, to guard, protect, and interpret the world. And I think what we are finding now is pretty much the opposite, where we in fact struggle to comprehend what is happening with the young children of the day, and they are in a position to explain to us and interpret what it is that they are seeing for our benefit, because we are clueless. So I think it's an interesting kind of a inversion that is taking place. What begins in children's world is becoming an adult anxiety today, revealing a generational rift. It's a rift, not in terms of of purpose. It's not as if the generations are have different purposes, but they have different meaning systems, and therefore there is a comprehension issue, not an alignment issue. That is really we are beginning to see. Children do seem to be residing in seemingly unfamiliar worlds, language and grammar that is disproportionately new, stories and characters that don't feel childlike. We have a certain imagination of what children's stories should be, and these do not correspond to that, and references that don't flow from our shared cultural past. So the idea of something, the present being in some sense is an extension of the past, of something that we draw from the past, perhaps interpreted in a new way, but nevertheless where the rooting is in the past, that is no longer the case. And therefore that again creates a sense of vertigo for the older generation, not being entirely sure where this comes from, because there is no visible source that is easy to trace. So is this the first discontinuous generation of our times? This growing up in a hyper digital global ecosystem, familiar childhood logic seeming to be dismantled, and making adults seem culturally outpaced. If you go back in time and we see that over successive generations, this is a journey that has been some years in the making. Millennials were the transitional generation. The self and their sense of self was still rooted in the physical, because they came from that kind of a world, and then they witnessed the rise of the digital. The digital world therefore was an extension of life for them. Technology was still seen through a utilitarian lens. It was something useful, it was something magical perhaps, but it lay outside of themselves. They were users of technology. And narrative identity was largely intact. I mean, they were digitally kind of supercharged in some forms, but they, in their sense of narrative, sense of identity, was very clear. With Gen Z, we started seeing a distancing take place. These are people who grew up inside the net, with the net. And they were, we called them digital natives. Identity became more performative because this was a generation exposed to social media. So nobody was merely a participant, we were all broadcasters. And therefore, identity had to become two-way, not just what you experienced of yourself, but what you presented of yourself. Self-presentation became a very, very important part of who you were. So you were nobody unless you could post about it. You didn't travel if you could not post about it. You didn't wear new clothes unless you could post about it. There was measurable social validation, and therefore there was which gave an outlet for self-expression, as well as became a source of anxiety, because you're constantly being judged. Everything, and the self was always in a beta mode. You were always refreshing yourself. The next DP, the next version of yourself, always looking for a version of yourself that was corresponding to the needs of the context that you were in. Global peer group, because of the fact that that's what social media enabled, and a fluid sense of self, an identity that was multiple. If you look at Instagram bios, people were not just accountants or students or management consultants. They were foodies, and they were deep sea divers in something or the other, and they were, the identity became various, and you could not just be one thing. With Gen Alpha, what one way of describing them is the algorithmic generation, and that is, I think, the difference between Gen Z and Gen Alpha. The algorithm is the primary navigator through this world, and it's a hyper fragmented culture. The attention is non-linear, because this is a generation growing up inside the digital ecosystem. They do not think of it as an ecosystem at all. They think of it as reality, and that is their reality, and therefore there are no limits and no boundaries. There is no sense of the digital world and the idea that you need to distance yourself from it, because that idea is ridiculous. You live inside that world. Much more intense emotional exposure that we see. You talked about anime, and there is both passivity, because there is, you're led by the algorithm, inside a sense of agency, because at one level you decide what you want to watch, but at another level that decision is made for you. So that kind of a sense of a seeming agency, that is actually governed by passivity of kind of surrendering to the algorithm. So this was the, in a sense, the background. What we were trying to do in this exercise was to decode Gen Alpha through their message consumption. So the focus here is on content and content consumption, but the idea was to try and infer, therefore, what their relationship with themselves and the outside world was through the content that they consumed. And so we were trying to become insiders into the worlds that are shaping childhood today. We delved deep into the worlds they inhabit through multiple vantage points. We had ethnographic interactions in 6 cities. We had ecosystem stakeholders, parents, coaches, hobby teachers. We did a lot of secondary reading by looking at what is the content they're consuming and what does that mean. And we spoke to experts, media marketers, psychologists. So the idea was to try and get an understanding of what is happening by looking at several sources and triangulating the information that we got. Let's just begin with the adult gaze, because that perhaps is the gaze that is the most bewildered. Devices are the arena where parenting is being negotiated and contested. It is an arena where parents frankly do not know what to do. There are shared screens. There is what we would call wink wink watching, where there is this ambivalence about the fact that you want to govern and monitor the usage of the device by children, but at the same time you recognize the fact that this is the world that the children are going to live in when they grow up, and you cannot deprive them from being fluent in this world. So there is this sense that you think you monitor, but you also do not do it that seriously, and therefore there is always this sense of ambivalence in the parental desire and ability to control the use of devices. And so what actually you see is an illusion of control, where you have just enough control so that you feel a little less guilty about not fully doing your job. So it really is guilt management, on the part of parents that is at work here, because they don't really know what to control and what not to. And so this parenting is a tightrope walk. You are anxious yet excited. There are times when your child really kind of stuns you with something that amazes you, and you say, wow, this is amazing. I mean, your child is capable of this, is something that makes parents excited, and yet they are anxious because they don't know what are the boundaries and what are the limits and what else the child is getting exposed to. They can neither embrace it nor reject it outright for reasons that I've already explained. They see the kids becoming more expressive, and yet they also see them being shaped by digital. There is also a passivity that they see. So it's like at one level, children are expressing themselves much more vividly, with much greater richness and fluency. On the other hand, they are also finding them passive, immersed, totally lost, and in a world that they cannot understand. They are proud of the kids' confidence and yet uneasy about what they can pick and where they can go and what they can do in their digital journey. So I think this ambivalence is something that was very striking in parents. So they're caught in a double bind. They must set boundaries in a landscape they cannot map, and must support children in ecosystem they themselves never grew up in. But they are also expected to guide, regulate, and protect, but they feel themselves to be culturally under-equipped, leading to a seemingly improbable but yet fundamental question: whose child is it anyway? Parents, teachers, or the algorithms? And it may feel like an outlandish question, but it's actually a very real question, because really what is happening is that the ambience of that the child is growing up in is really content, is really what is happening on the internet, and where the algorithm is the most natural guide. It is kind of gently leading the child into areas one by one. So the question is really, which influence is the greatest for the child? Is it the influence of parents or teachers, or is it really the influence that is between themselves and the screens that they are immersed in? So they are being, in a sense, raised in an authority vacuum. I'm not sure if this is very clear, the font, but parents, we already talked about, a bit trapped between, supporting and restricting. Experts take the moral high ground and virtue signal, and parents don't find it useful because they give high-minded advice which is impossible to implement, and so therefore there is not much help forthcoming when you talk to experts. And teachers and schools still run it through the system, which is school, which is regulated, which does not fully comprehend and respond to what is happening in the ecosystem today. So diminishing authority creates space for algorithms to lead and eventually shape childhood. It's an always on responsive presence, which is the other thing, that the the algorithm is never in a bad mood. The algorithm is always there to support you. The algorithm does not scold you. The algorithm does not ask you to do your homework. The algorithm is your friend in that sense. The stream of cues that serve as guidance for the unassuming, or it allows them in a sense and guides them and leads them into certain paths. And it's not just about entertainment preferences, but identity formation, emotional templates, all of this it is in a position to provide. So the challenge then is to introduce responsibility without dulling that sense of wonder, to ensure that what has just opened up for millions remains open, empowering, and safe. And I think that is a real challenge because it is easier said than done. Let's look at it from the child's perspective, entering the childverse. This is the digital playground. We got a front row seat to what Gen Alpha watches and enjoys, and we saw what they were. Horror, for instance, not just a content genre, but an aesthetic. And in general, this is true for Gen Alpha, that a lot of thing resides less in the area of meaning and more in the area of vibe. It's a sense, it's an aesthetic sense. It is just a sense of what something represents rather than necessarily the meaning that is embedded in it. Vlogs, the kind of family, new kind of family time, co-created and co-viewed with parents. The K world, which we know has kind of taken over the world in a variety of ways, but an emotional fantasy land leading them into adulthood. A kind of it is a very kind of underripe, but very, very rich kind of a portrayal that you find, which is typically what you see in a lot of Korean cultural products. Brain rot, which we always talk about, which is a very big part of social media consumption. Anime and manga, we talked about. Challenge videos, what if fantasy speaking to kids' curiosities. Lot of gaming, Minecraft, Roblox. It almost acts like a third place for kids today. It becomes another world, another dimension for kids to kind of live in. Streams, of course, and streamers become like background Sherpas, leading them into new worlds. Mirai already talked about Get Ready With Me, tiptoeing into lifestyle mood boards and kind of showing that fluency with the world of products, which again becomes a part of that universe. And it is not, therefore, the boundaries are very fuzzy. ASMR, which is an oddly satisfying videos, as almost as a response to sensory overload, where you kind of, again, very vibe centric, very, very much about mood and vibe. In terms of education, explosion of theme-based experiential learning content that we also saw. Feelings wale songs as vibes that capture their state of mind, that sense of just being able to capture, again, a particular kind of mood. We also saw regionalized global content mimicking global aesthetics and styles while portraying local culture from a regional vantage point. A lot of vernacular cultural icons, strong influence of South Indian cinema. Again, where you see the kind of hyper real is a very important part of the sort of cinematic language that you see there. So this is broadly the kind of content consumption that we saw. What was the child's gaze? I think the important thing to recognize is that for Generation Alpha, digital is society, not just media. Fundamentally, that is if you were to boil it down, that is really what it's about. That what we thought of as my generation, thought of as society, Samaj, the fact that we were embedded inside a certain culture. There were norms, there were rules, there were reciprocal expectations. I think that today is so, and we consume media. This is a generation that inhabits media, that resides within media, and therefore the idea of calling it media itself becomes moot. This is not media, this is society. For them, digital world is home, the most connected, fluent, and network generation in history, may also be the least aware of their own connectivity. And I think that's important. It's not as if they think of themselves as being connected. That's just society. That is the world they live in. And one way of thinking about it is to think of content as the new nature. They are growing up in a world where the primary markers are digital, not natural. If you think about our sense of everything, our sense of time, our sense of space, all of it came with our interaction with the physical world. Our sense of what shapes us has always been the physical world. We have that is what resists. That is what we are. We define ourselves in opposition to and in alignment with the physical world. Our concept of space and time and the self are built on natural scaffolding. Here, the self is gathered in a much more granular way. But what is very interesting is that there are no units of influence significant enough to serve as memory. If you think about it, earlier generations, our memory is based on concrete events, things that happened. They are milestones. But in a world that is full of small, kind of atomized social media posts, you don't have a sense of memory like that. You don't have concrete memory. It's all fuzzy. All of it is a blur that you have been consuming. And nothing is a strong enough unit of memory to be retained as memory. So you grow up with a lot of influences which you cannot name, which you cannot place, because all of it is part of this feed in that you do not really are able to differentiate one from the other. And that even today, even as adults, we get a sense of that. When we are scrolling through endless, we are doom scrolling. You can scroll the whole day, and if somebody asks you, okay, what did you see today? Name one reel you saw. And a lot of times you'll be hard pressed to name one reel that we saw. So our memory structures also are fundamentally getting shaped. But this is a generation where that is exclusively what they're being brought up on. So that sense of memory, that sense of how the self is arrived at without the journey, in a sense. You become somebody without quite knowing how you got there. And I think that the dimension of that are very many. We'll find out actually as they unfold in the fullness of time as to what that really means. Because right now we only have a sense of what is happening, but we don't quite have a sense of what that will potentially translate into. For Generation Alpha, and it's also important to acknowledge this, because it is easy for an older generation to think of this with great anxiety, with great fear, and a sense of foreboding. Because it is important to acknowledge that digital interactions still fulfill core needs, human needs, and even important development needs. There is a how do you belong? For instance, somebody saying, a mother saying, we make YouTube vlogs, he's singing Kesaria, we both are sitting in the swing in the park. How to trust themselves. An 8-year-old saying, I know what to watch and what to swipe. मैं गंदी चीजें नहीं देखता. How to learn. I asked GPT and how an app can be made that can make money also. So it's not as if it's important to recognize the fact that it is not as if it is fundamentally a situation where the young people are kind of being brainwashed. I mean, it's easy to build a narrative like that, and it's very easy to fall into the trap of judging this without fully comprehending it. So the phone as the primary interface to life has obviously some issues, but it also is a gateway to play, learn, and socialize. And for instance, this is a mother talking about the fact that there is a certain sense of belonging that it fosters. So the emerging mental model of content consumption is that of ambient intimacy. I think that's what we are seeing. There is a sense of intimacy, but it is in the air. It is a sense of ambient. Content is an ambience. Content is your ambience that you grow up in. There is the comfort of pointless presence. The fact that things don't have to mean something. They just have to be there. There's something has to be there. It is not necessarily important as to what is the point it is making. I've already talked about content as ambience. It's almost like a new kind of security blanket where you kind of are using content as a kind of palliative. It is a comforter. It fulfills so many roles, but it is a kind of pacifier at a certain level. It's just something that you are irresistibly drawn towards without necessarily knowing why and what you get out of it. Gaming, I think, is a very important space because it's a third space for kids to bond with other human beings. It is immersive, identity driven ecosystems. Like the parent of an 8-year-old kid says, if I do not let my son get into Roblox in the evening, then basically I'm not letting him go out to play. I find that really interesting. Today, these kids meet during evening virtually, there is no going out. So it's almost like in a world where parents today are much more wary about allowing their children to go out into the physical world. And this is not just what the child wants, it's also what the parents are hesitant about, where urban spaces do not allow for that easily. This is really the route to any form of socializing. This is the way in which children can build social skills, can be and hang out with other people. It just is virtual. And so that just, it's like just changing the context while meeting somewhat similar social needs. And we begin to see the appearance of AI playfully entering the future. It's a brand new gadget to poke play with. AI is less a technological tool and more an imagination machine. And I think that is, it's very powerful because in the hands of children, there is not the anxiety that adults can have. It is simply a fun tool. It is something that opens up the world. It allows you to think of new possibilities, and it is something that really feels like it is made for you to play with. And again, vibe building, using AI to bring flair to everyday life. And we will hear, I think, some of that when we talk to Mirai and Madhav from their own experience of how AI, what it means to them and what they're thinking about doing with it. And it's also marking a shift from didactic to a responsive idea of learning. I think it's also important to recognize it. Our notion of learning has always been top down. Most of the other generations in this room have been told that learning is a difficult process. Most of us have looked towards school and college with a sense of it being a burden. I don't think, there are very few of us who would actually think of the process of learning as something inherently enjoyable. For most of us, it has been a grind. It has been something we have to be subject to. We recognize that it's important, but we have rarely enjoyed it. And I think here you have the idea of learning, which is much more led by the individual. There is a sense of curiosity led learning rather than syllabus led learning. So it's not top down, it is bottom up. I mean, this is merely indicative, by itself is not important, but very few people recognize very kids recognize the Wikipedia symbol, but almost everybody recognizes the Chat GPT one. I think it just is two different modes of learning and two different worlds. I think that it just kind of symbolizes the change. What about advertising? Yes, excellent. So thank you so much. Uh, so advertising and Gen Alpha. So we've talked about this growing up in a blur, and already I think Subbu mentioned this. The lines between advertising and content are obliterated. I mean, we really don't see a very clear difference. So it's uncontained. What was very clearly contained, marked, bounded, has become uncontained today. Everything flows through multiple platforms, multiple devices, and therefore there is a general kind of a mishmash that we have of content and commercial intent. Advertising was always something that interrupted the kinetic streams of being. It was the price we paid for being interested in something. That was advertising was. If you wanted to see a film, then advertising came in the way. If you wanted to see a program we liked, advertising came in the way. If you want to read an article that we liked, advertising came in the way. Advertising was always the price that we paid for our interest in something else. Today, that is no longer the case. Advertising as a form is not particularly, advertising a form is very easy to reject by this generation as an overt advertising form. So advertising now becomes algorithmic adaptation. It becomes part of the algorithm. It becomes interwoven into narratives where there is no separation between advertising and content. And therefore that creates a legibility issue. How do you recognize advertising? And there's a whole bunch of things that are happening. Story integrated promotions, commerciality that hides behind loved creators. So you want to watch the creator, and there is a certain commercial intent that's slipped into that. Vlogs that naturalize brand appearance, formats that are built like the Get Ready With Me format is fundamentally built around products. So the format itself, or unboxing, is a format that is fundamentally built around a commercial idea. product that seem to naturally belong to gaming universes, and therefore they find their presence there without seeming to be intruding. And we see a lot of adult categories slipping in: beauty, fashion, tech. We find a beauty fluency in a younger generation that we never did before, as again we saw some evidence of. And therefore superlative consumption as entertainment, the whole idea of more higher order consumption becomes forms of entertainment, and in fact so many formats again that have to do with how something is cooked, how something is made, how something is consumed, as being by itself a format for entertainment. So early meaning making without selling. So brands become cultural objects rather than only being commercial objects. And we see brands that occupy those positions as cultural icons and not merely as something that are selling themselves. They may be looked up to by people who are not their consumers, but they become therefore markers in the cultural landscape. So what even is an ad anymore? So advertising lives inside algorithmic feeds where all of these entertainment, communication, information, and utility merge in one continuous stream. Very difficult to disaggregate. When the feed thinks for them in this content commerce continuum, the discovery isn't intentional. The feed chooses before the child does, while it appears that children have the freedom to choose. But it's actually the feed that is deciding for them. So I think that again, the passivity and the agency, that interplay, apparent agency, but there is a certain passivity within which that agency resides. And therefore, it is the feed that is actually telling children what to do. And the feed becomes the feast. Children are exposed to such rapid cycles of emotion and excitement that they start becoming numb to what they're watching. So the next wave of content has to be louder, faster, more intense to break through the growing numbness. It becomes an infinite loop of craving and saturation, each turn more intense than the last. And this is a certain pattern that we begin to see. So the emerging mental model of media consumption is the great media mukbang. I mean, the whole idea of mukbang being this performative consumption where people, these are these videos where people are eating copious amounts of food with great speed and great excitement, and which just becomes for some reason irresistible to watch for a lot of people, where you just see people gorging on various things, and that becomes something that is a sight. And in some senses, that is what we are seeing here. Every element is crafted to provoke a reaction. The constant flashes, jump cuts, sound bursts train the mind to expect the next hit. Kids are endlessly slurping, chewing, crunching, and gulping down streams of videos, memes, and games. So you see this kind of an overload, which by itself becomes a spectacle. In this environment of fluid, chaotic, and never-ending media streams, navigation becomes a challenge for brands and creators addressing keys. How do you do that? How do you do that responsibly? How do you do that well? So what about regulatory principles in such a landscape where the earlier life was easy, although it may not have seemed so at that time? But life was easy because they were clearly marked. You knew what you had to regulate. So you don't know what you have to regulate. And how is an even more complicated question. So because digital is a perpetually mutating system with continuously shifting rules and boundaries. So it's not stable. It's not a steady categories. The categories themselves are fluid. They are shifting. What we call digital content is itself mutating at a very fast pace. So content that defies classification, parents navigating it all with partial visibility. They want to, partly they don't. So it's in that kind of a middle space. And any regulation seems like interruption to children because they are not seeing it as something that where they are being exploited or used. They are seeing it just as content. That is the world that they live in. So this creates a regulatory gap defined by uncertainty rather than clarity. And this uncertainty is definitional. It comes from definitions. It's not surface uncertainty. It is deep structural uncertainty that we are talking about. The answer perhaps lies less in exhaustive regulation and more in setting guidelines that gently steer behavior. And I don't think in some ways this is a choice simply because I don't think there is any other option. There is very little room for hard, exhaustive regulation simply because you don't know what to cut out and what to keep. It's not easy to make that distinction. So perhaps some principles: a universal signposting for commercial content recognizable by everyone, not just kids. Like we have vegetarian, non-vegetarian, we have a lot of things where we signpost in a universal way. so that there is a certain amount of clarity there. Locating responsibility across the ecosystem, parents, creators, advertisers, and I think where bodies like ASCI play such an important role is in sensitizing, I think, particularly the marketing ecosystem to the need for responsibility, given the fact that at a certain level, all of us are parents, also just as much as we are marketers. And I think the idea of responsibility that must be carried across the ecosystem is an important one. Building on existing protection on digital platforms, making safeguards legible and future ready, which I think is an ongoing exercise, and strengthening media literacy as a shared foundation, age appropriate advertising understanding. And I think this is really, really important. I think from an industry perspective, I think if the industry wants to avoid much harder kind of regulatory intervention, I think it becomes very important for industry to recognize that this is a fluid, it's a difficult area where responsibility is something that will actually help and enable rather than restrict. The task is not censorship, but creating structures that protect without patronizing, that encourage platform level accountability, and that give parents a fighting chance in an environment they can no longer supervise alone. I think that really is what the intent is of any intervention. Some takeaways for advertisers: first and foremost, is be very careful about addressing this group. This is a vulnerable and sensitive group. So the idea is, in fact, first to ask yourself whether you really need to address them. But other takeaways: advertising here isn't about inserting message in media, but about creating cultural legitimacy. This is for a lot of this generation, what they see is part of culture. And it is important, therefore, if you want a place in this world, you need to be culturally legitimate. You need to have a place in this culture. From influence to company, that's what actually today the algorithm does. It provides company. It accompanies children in their lives. So the need to be part of that journey, I think, is an important one. Over distant authority, it's continuous presence. Frequent, continuous, low intensity presence is what creates vibes, is what creates the sense of being a participant in the lives of children. From persuading parents to creating a meaningful presence, that's what in the life of Gen Alpha, the parents today do not have the same authority that they did earlier. And therefore, it is about actually partnering children. That is important. From production values to aesthetic consonance, I mean, really we've talked about this often enough in this presentation. It's a vibe, it's a mood, it's a visual language. This is a far more visually fluent generation than any other before it. And therefore, and a lot is decoded from the visual and the aesthetic of it rather than what specifically is provided as content and meaning. And therefore, that becomes very important. And identity is assembled in the moment. It calls for modular remixable brands. And the moment changes. So the idea of deep engagement with brands that is continuous, long term, gets replaced with context sensitive kind of brand engagement, where in the moment, it's not about what the brand says about me, but what can I use it in the moment? How is it useful to me in the moment? That is the kind of relationship between brands and this cohort. And from narrative building to memetic modifications, by what I mean by that is not long term narrative building as much as it is continuously in a short term sense, providing something that tickles and is able to move with the evolving kind of a palette that this cohort has. That was really the presentation. That was what I think I tried to, essentially the team and I, representing them, tried to sort of point out. I think to me, the biggest takeaway from this has been the recognition that we are not talking about yet another generation with a higher degree of digital nativity. We are talking about something fundamental having changed. And I think the most important thing is, therefore, to think, to research, to understand before any action is taken. To me, that is really been something that this is a study that has surprised a lot of us working on it. It is not something that we kind of expected in a certain sense. But the fact that it kind of threw up the kind of information and insight it did, I think, has been very helpful. I think a lot of people who are parents also kind of it helped them make sense of their own incomprehension. And I think to that extent, there was this, there's a very real life kind of a sense in which the study was useful for people to say, okay, I now get at least a sense of what I don't know, even if I don't get a sense of what I know. So if it does that, that is some use. Thank you so much for your patience.